Great Britain had always regulated the economies of its respective colonies through acts and laws passed by Parliament. Through the last century, these laws had only been loosely enforced, as the economic gains of the American colonies also benefit Great Britain. As the 1760s began, however, Britain needed to regain control of the financial situation, sparking animosity from the colonists who had long appreciated their free economic relationship, and raising questions on the constitutional rights of the American colonists. In 1764, the Sugar Act was imposed to regulate the amount of French and Dutch sugar and molasses being imported to the colonies in favor of sugar and molasses being sold by the British East India Company. While it lowered the cost of sugar from the East India Company, colonists saw the act as a violation of their rights to trade and conduct business. Colonists protested the Sugar Act by boycotting British goods affected by the act. While this form of protest was not widely successful from an economic standpoint, the East India Company had one of its best years in 1774. The protest was noted by British Parliament, and many Whigs within the British government warned that relations could worsen if some sort of agreement could not be met. The following year, in 1765, the Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first act of Parliament ever directed specifically at the colonies, as opposed to across the empire. The Stamp Act would require any form of official paper to need an official stamp. The act affected newspapers, almanacs, and official documents, such as licenses, deeds, and wills. It even meant that playing cards required the official stamp. Such a direct tax had never been levied against the colonists, and many saw it as an attack by the Parliament in response to the boycotts the year before. Secret organizations known as the Sons of Liberty began to appear throughout the colonies and threatened violence on anyone who sold the stamps. Indeed, violence began to break out across the region as the Sons of Liberty targeted British officials who enforced the act. In one such case, the home of Lieutenant Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson was ransacked by an angry mob led by the Sons of Liberty. While Hutchinson and his family escaped the violence, their home was destroyed. Some colonists, however, did not act out in violence, but relied instead on a united political action. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City and compiled a Declaration of Rights and Grievances for the British Parliament. The declaration stated the position of many of the American colonists, stating that the British taxes levied without representation violated their rights as not only British subjects, but as men. Again, the Americans engaged in protest by boycott, this time with significant results. The income from imports to the American colonies fell from £2,250,000 in 1764 to £1,944,000 in 1765. In England, American statesman Benjamin Franklin argued the case of the American colonies to Parliament and warned that continued abuse of the colonists could and would result in rebellion. Fortunately for the colonies, the Parliament experienced a shift in government which had sympathy for Whig politics, which resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act. The Parliament passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, reversing the Stamp Act, but at the same time insisting that the Parliament as a legislative body had the right and power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Both sides viewed the result as a political victory, believing that their interpretation of the rights of the colonists had been heard and secured. The Parliament believed it had exerted its will as the governing body of the colonies, and once and for all had established their right to levy laws on them. And the Americans believed that the British Parliament would not ever directly tax them again. Without some form of representation, a door had been left open, and if the British government was not careful, it might be able to close again. In 1767, things were still not going well economically for the British. The Rockingham government, which had helped repeal the Stamp Act, was suffering at the hands of their Tory opponents, who criticized them harshly and felt that they had been played by the American colonists. Charles Townshend, who served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the ministry of William Pitt the Elder, found himself in control of the administration when Pitt suddenly passed away in 1766. Townshend himself died a year later, but before he did, urged by the financial crisis and the insistence of the Tory factions within Parliament, passed a series of 5 acts which would collectively bear his name, the Townshend Acts. The first act, known as the Revenue Act, imposed direct taxation on lead, glass, paper, paint, and, notably, tea. The second created a new customs board for the North American colonies in Boston, and allowed customs officials unprecedented control over vessels coming in and out of colonial ports. The third suspended the New York Assembly from conducting business until it had complied with the requirements of the Quartering Act, passed in 1765 alongside the Stamp Act. The fourth act, known as the Indemnity Act, colloquially known as the Tea Act, lowered the commercial duties on tea imported by the East India Company, hoping to combat the smuggling of Dutch East India tea into English ports. The final act, known as the Colonial Trade Act, passed after Townshend's death in 1767, also aimed to target smuggling, and granted admiralty courts jurisdiction over all matters concerning customs violations, taking away the authority of local colonial courts. Before his death, Townshend feared that it would provoke a rebellious response from the American colonists. Townshend could not have been more correct. A flurry of activity gripped the American colonies. Pamphlets and letters flew from the pens of lawyers and farmers alike as they published their grievances in papers and broadsides across the colonies. Committees of correspondence were formed and shared ideas and debated the political and economic situation in the colonies. Once again, the Sons of Liberty were active, implementing the boycott of British goods and inciting riots where the opportunity was ripe. Particularly in Boston, unrest began to foment in such a way that the customs officials were obliged to leave town. This prompted British authorities to send for British troops to occupy Boston to quell the mob. On March 5, 1770, the consequences became quite clear when a young British sentry guarding the Boston Customs House was set upon by an angry mob of colonists. Accounts of the event state that the incident began as an argument between the private and a young wigmaker's apprentice, who upon insulting the private and his officer, was warned away from the post. Refusing to go and further insulting the officer, he was struck in the head by the private's musket. A crowd began to gather as the altercation grew louder, and bells rang out indicating a fire, drawing yet more Bostonians toward the lone sentry. The sentry sent a runner to get help, as the crowd became more violent, throwing ice and oyster shells at the sentry and calling for him to fire his weapon. Captain Thomas Preston and a handful of men from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment of Foot arrived at the scene and deployed around the sentry with bayonets fixed. The crowd, now grown to 300 or 400 by some estimates, pressed in around the British troops, still throwing objects and shouting for them to fire. Preston shouted for the crowd to disperse and ordered his men to load their muskets. As the crowd pressed in on Preston and his men, they shouted, "Fire, damn you, fire!" A young private was struck in the head by a flying object, causing him to drop his musket. He bent to retrieve it and stood up and unintentionally fired into the crowd without orders. In a panic, the rest of the soldiers fired into the crowd in a ragged volley. As the crowd broke in horror and the smoke cleared, it revealed 3 dead colonists: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. A mixed-race former slave, Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr, were wounded and would die shortly after. 5 colonists had been killed in what would be known as the Boston Massacre. The city was put on high alert, and British troops mustered in full force, preparing to defend against further riots. The trial which followed was a media circus, as the Sons of Liberty latched onto those who had died as patriots and martyrs. Attorney John Adams defended the British soldiers despite his own personal feelings toward the British abuse of the American colonies, and his relationship to his cousin Samuel Adams, who was one of the founding members of the Sons of Liberty. Adams, whose devout loyalty to the law led him to believe that all men were entitled to a trial, no matter who they were or what they had done, successfully argued the men were not guilty of murder and had 6 of these soldiers acquitted and 2 others found guilty only of manslaughter. Adams' experience in the aftermath of the trial did little to move him closer to his cousin's patriot leanings, but did affirm his belief in the legitimacy of a government of laws. Tensions remained high in Boston, but gradually began to recede elsewhere. In 1773, amidst one of the worst banking crises of the 18th century, the British Parliament again made an attempt to ensure the survival of the British East India Company by undercutting the illegal importation of Dutch tea to the American colonies, while lowering the cost of EICT to the lowest possible amount. Known as the Tea Act of 1773, the act allowed the EIC to unload its cargo in the American colonies without paying any duties on it, while charging an exorbitant amount on Dutch tea. The act prompted the Sons of Liberty to organize a raid on 3 merchant ships docked in Boston Harbor, carrying loads of East India Company tea which had yet to be offloaded. Known as the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships and dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor. The loss of tea amounted to approximately 9,659 pounds in 1773, the equivalent of $1.7 million today. Parliament was outraged and responded by passing a series of acts known as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. The first 3 acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, all targeted Massachusetts alone, and punished the city of Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony for its role in the Tea Party. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. The act angered citizens in Boston who had not even participated in the Tea Party, and they felt they were being punished unjustly without being able to testify in their own defense. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked Massachusetts' charter and brought the colony under direct British control. Town meetings were limited, and all appointments had to be appointed by the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor of Massachusetts to order the trial or retrial of any royal official to take place in Great Britain if the accused could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The final act, which affected all of the colonies, was the Quartering Act of 1774, which allowed royal governors to house soldiers in buildings if suitable quarters were not provided by the colonies. These acts were the last straw for many colonists. The perceived violation of what they viewed as their natural and constitutional rights as British subjects threatened to turn resentment of their British mother country to hatred and send the colonists into rebellion.